we are a deeply social species, and you can't even understand individual behavior without understanding the groups that you belong to. That contextual force is pretty strong. And what we found over and over again was that people are just radically misreading their own groups. And this is this concept of a collective illusion, which is, I'm sure like that phenomenon's been around for 100 years, but
Mhm.
it's gone by of various names. Like I took the liberty of changing the name because in the literature it's called pluralistic ignorance, which
Mhm.
drives me nuts. Like it because it's it's a bad name when every academic paper usually starts out with, well, okay, this is kind of a misnomer. It's not pluralism, and nor is it ignorance. It's not that
Right.
you don't know about your group, you think you know and you're wrong.
Mm, right. Which is more dangerous, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you say, you defined it well right now, but I'll just read a little bit from your book that, simply put, as you say, collective illusions are social lies. They occur in situations where a majority of individuals in a group privately reject a particular opinion, but they go along with it because they incorrectly assume that most other people accept it. I
Yeah.
noticed too, right on the very front of your book, one of the endorsements was from the author Adam Grant, and he wrote that your book is an illuminating analysis of why groups believe things their members don't. And that's a phrase that captures it nicely, that groups as a sort of super organism believe something that each of its constituent elements don't actually endorse. And
Yeah.
so how does that happen? So I know that's a very open-ended question, but
It's
let me
perfect.
pose that to you. How
No,
does
it's
that
perfect.
happen?
Because what's funny about collective illusions is that, while there were examples of them, and I talk about in the book all the way back to like this Elm Hollow study, which was one of the
Mhm,
first public opinion studies ever done. Um, but like in the 70s, psychologists were like, listen, this just doesn't happen very often. If anything, we have a bias toward assuming everyone else is like us. And
mm,
so that's the phenomenon we should focus on. But as I'll explain in just a sec, with the rise of social media, that's not the problem anymore. And so if you think about, so we'll talk about how they've gotten on steroids with social media, but just like how they form, because it's pretty crazy. Like, how are you wrong about your group? And so
mm,
you just need to know like two things about how your mind or brain works, right? Like, first, we all have a conformity bias, all of us. Uh, and that's not necessarily bad, right? Like, it's just all else equal, you'd rather be with your group, not
mm,
against your group.
mm,
And in the book, I lay out some of my favorite examples of this, this kind of conformity bias is true even about things like who you think is good looking. It
mm,
matters what your group believes, and there's some real survival value to that, right? Like it's you don't survive very long when you're outside of groups as human beings. So, but for that conformity bias to be productive, you actually have to know what your group believes, because otherwise,
mhm.
what are you conforming to? And
Right.
this is where it's tricky, right? So your brain, as you know, is like it's an energy hog to begin with. Like it's just it's the size of two fists put together, and it's consuming just disproportionate amount of metabolic energy. And so it's always looking for those through evolution, these kind of shortcuts, right? How do I reduce energy expenditure? Well, it turns out one of those shortcuts that it uses is how it estimates group consensus, and it uses this shortcut. Your brain assumes the loudest voices repeated the most are the majority. So in a sense, it mistakes noise for numbers. And look, it was probably always a little like finicky, but it worked reasonably well when we lived in small groups and we kind of knew each other.
Mm,
But now let's take just social media, and this is where this becomes a huge problem. If you just look at what was Twitter, is now X, the research on that is pretty clear. Roughly 80% of all the content generated on that platform is created by 10% of the users. And those users aren't even remotely representative of the broader public. They are extreme on almost every social issue.
mm, good.
But then you can see this problem. If 10% of people hold a sort of fringe view, but you think that it's 80%,
mm,
then unless you're willing to go against your group, which very few people really are consistently, then you'll self-silence or you'll even outright what Tim McCurran calls preference falsification. You'll actually lie about your views um, to go along to get along. And if enough people do that, then the only voices anyone hears from are these fringes, and the result's a collective illusion. And just to put it into modern context now, we just published this is called the social pressure index, looking at where people were lying about 64 of the most sensitive issues in the country, 19,000 person sample. Um, and we first asked people point blank, like, would they even admit to the fact that they have self silenced in the last year alone? Like, withheld something they really wanted to say because they thought they would offend somebody else. And so they just didn't say it. 61% of Americans admit to self silencing in the last year. I mean, it's just unbelievable that level. And so that this sense of social pressure to have the right opinion because we believe that our groups believe things they don't. And what's
right.
funny is it would be one thing if it was just like one or two issues, but we have more private opinion data on the American public than anybody. I'm quite certain of that. If you name anything that matters, it is a coin toss whether you are right or wrong about what your group believes. It's just it's crazy.
Mm. Hey, I mean, I would be in that 61%. I'm reflecting on this on a personal level, and I definitely um, am victim of this.
Yeah.
What's so interesting is, how liberating it must be to actually speak with your mind and say what you really think, and then realize that the group maybe does agree with you, even though it appears as if they don't.
Yeah. Right, because if you think about human beings have a deep desire for expression. And in fact, the research on self-silencing is pretty wild. Like, it's consistently linked with cardiovascular disease,
Mm,
particularly in women. I don't think it's just women, but that study I'm referencing was done with women. Like greater levels of self-silencing, withholding your views. It's
yeah,
not that surprising. You don't want to withhold your
right,
views, and it
right.
creates an internal stress. Like cortisol, elevated cortisol is bad for
Mm,
your body.
right.
And, but what we were starting to find is that and we can talk about some of them, it's just crazy how bad they are. But I think that, like, number 1, if you realized that the self-silencing you're self-silencing to belong to the group, but, like or you're lying about your views so you'll belong. But if that's not what the group really believes, you're actually doing real harm to the group. So it's
Mm,
not just the individual consequences, although those are true. There's also collective consequences that, whole societies can be undone by these things.